We're trying to have a series of engagements all over the country. We've started at the SAMRC, and I might wish to add just one thing about the SAMRC. The president of the SAMRC is Professor Glenda Gray, and one of the things that she has done is to allow us, or at least the SAMRC, to have, with the leadership of the unit I'm part of, the Violence, Injury and Peace Research Unit, to write a concept document about decolonizing the health sciences and medical research in particular. And her brief to us was that this would probably be the first among the research councils in South Africa. So that's been one amazing and immediate reward of trying to work on decolonization. Earlier this year, I went to Washington, D.C. From last September, I wanted to go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture because of the building in particular. David Ajayi's architectural marvel is something you want to visit once in your lifetime. He's probably the greatest living architecture right now practicing in the world. And it takes a while to get tickets to get there. But eventually, I managed to persuade some people to get me. The queues are long. So for the architecture and how the museum is curated, I highly recommend a visit if you ever get the time and the chance and you can bear the long haul to DC. But the museum's work captures a cruel and unbelievable violence by whites meted out to Africans, and the museum traces this. It leaves one with a bitter knowledge of what colonialism and slavery and racism really meant. And this picture of many shows that in 1855, in January, there will be a sale without reserve of slaves, of humans. I mean, if you are walking in this 4 or 5 floors of history, you start to grasp the magnitude of cruelty and indignities that some people can mete out to others. And yet what the curators managed to do is show how Africans, those who are the essential below of their country, to reference Ta-Nehisi Coates' amazing book called Between the World and Me, a letter to his son, how they survived, bruised and battered, but overcame incredible odds to make America their home, in spite of the continuing injustice, redlining, impoverishment, marginalization, and police brutality. But I don't want to talk about that today. I want to talk about this. On the Mall in Washington, D.C. is the Museum of the American Indian. One of the things I learned, spent a day right there, I always like to go there and it's easier to get in, is a small and a short and simple lesson. The American Indians had an unbelievable philosophy, an ethic about life. They thought rivers live, that the earth lives, but they lost. American natives lost. They were colonized, they were brutalized, they were enslaved, even with an amazing philosophy. Hundreds of years later, we come around. We say, Save the earth. The earth lives. The rivers live. So an amazing philosophy will not save you. Not wanting to be part of a world that cares, of teaching that cares, of research that cares, might not save you. And today, as you know, it's a big day in our country. So not taking a position will not save you. So I learn again and again from the amazing art and this philosophy that colonization, even today, under the Trump administration, when they're drilling for fossils and creating divisions in the US and globally, that something was lost in those years back. So while I hope I'm going to spend the next 10, 15 minutes of my input, I hope that what I'm going to speak will have a resonance to disciplines other than the one I was trained in, because I don't want to talk in generalities. So I'm going to ground my talk in the discipline in which I was trained, in which my earliest alienation from teaching and from colonial knowledge was most intense. I was trained in psychology, and part of the training was received at this university. Psychology is a great example because it can never make up its mind whether it's a health science, it's a social science, it's management studies, or it's part of education faculty. So it's a great example because it cuts across a number of divisions. So 2 years after the democratic elections in the country, I was young, early 20s, which was just pure luck. Early 20s, I got a job as a lecturer. It doesn't happen. I see my PhD students struggling to get jobs. But also in Germany, lots of PhDs in engineering even don't have jobs. So pure luck, I got a job as a lecturer. I don't know what I was doing in front of a class, but they hired me at a historically black university. After 8 years of increasing managerialism and ever-increasing number of students, you could see from 1 year you're teaching 100 students. The next year it's 400. It's doubling up. You end up with a class of 2,000. I could no longer breathe, literally. And I tendered my resignation. At the last minute, after accepting a job in government, thank God, it never happened, but I accepted a job, which would have been a really bad decision for me, as my friends kept on telling me before I accepted the job. For there is much that is rewarding in the academy. But one has to work very hard to find this. So I got a temporary reprieve from the university. They say, okay, you can divide your time between 2 departments. And this is where I started to work on violence as a public health matter, of course, right back then. But the reprieve was short-lived. It has become clear to me over the years, when I get grayer and bolder, of the effects of working in historically colonial, racist, sexist institutions, that the one effect is to reduce the health and quality of life of the people who work there. I see it today at UCT, when my friends are battling every day. I think, how do you work here? How do you survive this? So particularly those who are made not to feel that they don't belong, have to battle this thing of coming to work and literally being made to feel sick. I wasn't working at a place where I was made not to belong. But my university is an apartheid creation. All the universities, except 2 right now, or is it 2 or 3, that are not. And for much of its life, that university, my university, has struggled to create a humanizing and creative structures for students and staff. And so it has been haunted by protest ever since. And they had one last month. Now, colonization makes the colonized and their descendants sick, literally. Of course it does. Colonialism does more than cause disease and injuries. It treats the colonized as less than human, of course. Because dehumanization of natives, Native Americans I spoke about, whether in African countries, in the Americas, in India, of women, of queers, is inbuilt into colonial and racist structures and sexist structures and relationships we have where we work. So let me say just a little bit about this idea of dehumanization. Dehumanization is epitomized by the slave. The slave is the dehumanized par excellence. The slave cannot feel pain. He's undeserving of all that comes with human freedom, with being human. Because pain is for humans. The moment you recognize somebody as equally human, something happens there. You feel pain for them. So, and human freedom too. Human freedom is per definition for humans. So to be a slave is not just simply to be without power. You're not just powerless. And it is not simply without liberty, as one might be in prison. The slave is below society. So beyond the facts of powerlessness, of unfreedom, of captivity, is the more lasting understanding that is bitten into the psyche, so that one learns not to expect worldly delivery from serfdom, or, quite important, empathy for one's subjection. The slave struggles too, but cannot, without imperiling himself or herself, think of him or herself and want to be thought of as a man or a woman. So if you're a slave and you want to say, treat me like a man, you are already putting yourself in danger. Because you'll be whipped, you'll be shot, you'll be maimed. Same thing with the slave non-woman, call her non-woman. This is Pumladine Otola's book. She says something about the slave woman cannot be raped. The enslaved non-woman is the archetype of the unrapeable non-woman, because she's uninjurable. So you don't feel that you are raping. It's your property, you can do whatever you want. So as non-women and non-men, and this is a concept that I'm thinking quite a lot, and I see that I'd missed it a long time ago. So the slave body is uninjurable. So when you go to Addington Hospital, you start to realize that there are traces of this about some people are uninjurable, that they don't feel as sick as us. So you can let them die. HIV/AIDS in this country was part of that. Basically it was part of that. That some people's lives are not worth saving. The poor, we do this with the poor. We do this historically with blacks, with natives, and so on. But these people, the slave, the people who are below an institution, are essential for the economy, for the working of that. They clean for us. They work for us. Women, historically, are in this position, that their work is not recognized as work. That's it. You don't recognize their work. So you can become a professor and you travel the world. But some people are taking care of things at home. But of course, historically, we've supported, the world has moved towards supporting women to work. But the time use, women still use more time. That is called non-work. Same thing with the slave. So this idea of who is injurable and who is not, whose work counts and who doesn't, is a notion that deserves thinking about in studies of decolonization of knowledge, of our practices, and then the humanization of teaching, learning, and research. Because uninjurability or injurability is one of the afterlives of slavery and colonialism. Studies, contemporary studies. Last year, two pieces in an American journal tells you about that people believe that blacks feel less pain than whites. It's the most incredible thing. That black athletes are not as injurable as white athletes. How does this work? That some bodies don't feel as much pain? This is an experimental study. So this is particularly for black men today. Other research points out that black men are, of course, dehumanized or infrahumanized, meaning seen as not characterized by the essence of the human. So dehumanization and infrahumanization of black men is associated then with callousness and brutality against them by the police. Marikan is a good example. Dehumanization flows from moral exclusion, the process which enables the slave, the oppressed, black men, black women, queers, to be perceived as outside the boundary in which moral values, rules, and considerations of fairness apply. So once you're morally excluded, once you don't think somebody is human, you do not matter. The person doesn't matter. It's not even the person. So your whole life does not matter. You can be raped, you can be maimed, you can be murdered, and anything that is done to you is permissible. Let me step back a little bit and go back to how I arrived at this, or at least some things tied to this. So in 2015, as you know, Professor Duma has said this, there are student protests for decolonized free education, brought back for some of us, teachers, researchers, workers, and of course students, the old questions about what a decolonized, more human, African-situated research and teaching could look like. And this search for a decolonized teaching and research, in my case, a decolonized African psychology, but also work around violence, has a long history. The more you search, the more you start to see the struggle that I was talking about that you can see at the museum, a museum there, but also in the Cape. But the students give us a momentum to think about this. And the more you, or at least the more I think about it, you might call it, we are entering a third phase of these struggles. In psychology, call it the third moment. So what characterizes this is this invitation. The students basically are inviting us, so not very nicely sometimes. So I travel and talk to students. At 2015, I am at Rhodes Must Fall. They basically, quote unquote, imprison me for 4 hours because I'm trying to say it is important for us, even in the struggle, that young black men, young white men have more healthier relationships, more progressive relationships with women, with queers. They say, no, this is not about that. This is about racism and decolonization. I say, how can you think about decolonization without thinking about sexualities and gender and our full humanity? But they say, wait, I lose the argument basically. 6 hours later, I leave Rhodes Must Fall. I think, what is it that I'm not doing right? What is it that I'm not getting through about this? But this is important. So the invitation is not always nice. But it is an invitation. The invitation is to make South African institutions, universities in Africa more broadly, for us. Let me just concentrate on this. It makes us move away to think of ourselves as a mine, that our scholarship should work like a mine, extractive. Because our innovation system, which I'm part of, I chair a research committee at an NRF, the innovation system rewards you if you publish in the Lancet. It rewards you that. If you publish in the New England Journal of Medicine, you get a page on the SAMRC website. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but if you're rewarding that, people will publish there. So you don't create African publics for your knowledge. You don't think these publics are as important as other publics elsewhere. This is how the reward system works. So all of us then start publishing, wanting to publish in high impact journals. Once again, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I'm saying there's a place for theory making for people here. There's a place in the world for other worlds, what Walter Mignolo called pluriversality, and I'll come back to it. Now, in many sciences, in many health sciences, in the social sciences, in psychology in particular, it's undeniable that the discipline is dominated by the US and Western Europe. For the English-speaking world, it's Britain, a little bit of Australia, but the US is the leader of that. And in South Africa, then you have an odd thing, that American psychology becomes our center of the world, basically. It gives us the important questions. So you have to follow a certain way of asking questions, of approaching, of even teaching. The textbook we've been using for a long time come from the US. It's got a big publishing houses right there. So African psychology, which should be centered in Africa, is Euro-American centered. That's a problem. Because American psychology is great, but it is American psychology. It starts with America and ends with America, and it exports to others. And if you can't create your own psychology or your discipline, then you'd have to follow that. And in that sense, then you recolonize yourself. So you effectively perpetuate your own alienation. As a teacher, you get in front of a class, you are mimicking, basically. The moment you start recognizing this, that you are mimicking, you are a mime, as Homi Baba would say. And in that moment, you alienate yourself because you don't have this ownership of this knowledge. You don't create it yourself, you just import it and just give it to your students. And the students, of course, will give it to their students and all of this. And I become an expert in some wonderful person, but they are in America. And they could be black, by the way, but they are in America. Their center is America. They are talking to an American student who's sitting at Princeton, which looks like a hotel, while you're working at Fort Hare or at a university at Mangosuthu Technikon, where students don't have somewhere to sleep. So basically, you're not talking to the conditions of their lives. So in one sense, the reproduction of American-centered knowledge and European-centered knowledge is part of coloniality, and alienation is a key concept here. But this problem is not, by the way, just an African problem. It's all the Global South. The Global South is affected by this. That's why you see an eruption in the Americas, especially the School of Coloniality from South America. And the Indian School of the Subalterns happened to do the same thing a while back. But also Eastern Europe, the global semi-peripheries, as you know, also feel like America is all around us and Western Europe is all around us. But as I said, this invitation is an exciting moment, and I think I want to rush ahead and see what I can get done in the next 2 minutes. Because what students are asking us is ask fresh questions. Speak to us and give us different answers, because we come from a residence where we don't have anywhere to sleep. We don't have something to eat. We come to your class and you don't recognize this? Who are you teaching for? And of course, my learning is affected by the conditions of my lives. And so these questions have a long history, but they're enduring, and we have to work on this. So here are 3 issues. 3 issues in the light of the call by students to decolonize South African universities that point to how I think we, as teachers, as researchers, different kinds of practitioners, might think and work towards a less alienating, a more desalienating, a decolonizing our teaching and professional training, research practices, and structures. The structures in which we manage universities as deans, as vice chancellors, and that sort of thing. The first issue is a disciplinary one. Any discipline, but my discipline in particular, psychology, which for a long time, 14 years I realized, was counting, was desalienated from, until I arrived at something which I will not have time to speak about. It's precisely colonialism and coloniality, how they have reshaped knowledge. And I spoke about the American Indian right here, including how we come to think of what knowledge is. So very bright, very incredibly bright people ask me, but how do you decolonize engineering? I can't even handle that question, because unless you are really, or how do you colonize medicine or microbiology? Because decolonization is not one thing. It includes bringing people of different bodies to teach. That's it. That's part one of it. If students can identify with somebody that teaches them. They can identify, knowledge becomes not just intellectual, it becomes affective. Affective, it becomes emotional, that they have a stake in the knowledge. So you have to create that. That's one part of it. Another part, of course, is curriculum. Curriculum is really important. And that means where you start and where you end. It doesn't mean in my discipline that Freud, who was an amazing thinker, is not important, but it means where do you start? It doesn't mean Piaget, who does cognitive structures, which can be universal, is not important, but it depends where you start and where you end. And it's been shown again and again about if you're going to test children in math in their language, language being another important one, in their language, about the concept that they know, mathematics becomes easy. It becomes really easy. Mathematics is not such a, but it depends how you teach them, where you start and where you end. So I can say more about this. I'm going to skip that. Second issue that confronts us as teachers, as learners, as researchers, is to think dangerously about disciplinary knowledge, to think about the power of location. I've already spoken about this. By this I mean by thinking dangerously, which I take from another anti-colonialist thinker, Amy Césaire, a long time ago. I mean thinking decolonially, transgressively, against the canon, against what is called the discipline. I don't understand why in my discipline, for instance, something like corruption is not a central thing to study. Or dictatorships. Who becomes a dictator? What are the conditions for it? Because it's not important for American psychology to start dictatorships. Of course, somebody who came from Africa, who's quite well known now in the US, studies dictators. So you can go on and on and on. So this is location. If you're thinking about that psychology is these 12 topics for first year, and you're leaving out something important for venality, for greed, for corruption, you are missing out really important things that people see in the newspapers, on their television sets. If you're not teaching young black women about beauty, right, as a psychological topic, so you're studying it psychologically, this demands work, writing. And you have to create networks for people to write, for students to say, this is an important issue, let me study this. It happens in all the health sciences. You have to start with people, and if HIV, which became that, becomes a really important thing for this country, you had to study it. But of course, again, you know about the funding. Melissa Gates and Bill Gates is funding that. And so African countries are not funding their own, the work that is necessary. And that's part of the work. So by location, I mean that the world doesn't have the same problems everywhere you are. If you are in Warsaw or Welkom, the problems are different. And you have to start with the problems in that country, taking the globe, Europe, America, and come back. I have to stop right now. The last thing then is, if Freud is writing in Vienna, my discipline, if Freud is writing in Vienna and seeing middle-class women coming into the therapy, and you realize that people don't have money to pay for therapy, and you're still doing long-term therapy, there's a disjuncture right there. But you have to think of Freud as an embodied person, as a person with a body, that they're dealing with, that they're writing about what happens in front of them. So they have a body, they're not disembodied, sitting somewhere in a library, but they're dealing with everyday problems that they have. So the disembodied author of theory, of the textbooks, of the articles, is an important consideration here. And of course, as you can see, it ties in with black scholars or women scholars. If you have a queer scholar, if you have a trans scholar in front, students do something else more than just learn what is in the book. They learn about this embodied person, that you can be a scholar, even if you're trans, lesbian, black, Nigerian, not only when you are white American males. And this points to something that a philosopher called Pauline Hontonji speaks about, scholarly extraversion and scholarly introversion. Basically, they say the global south generates knowledge not for itself, but because it's supplying the global markets of knowledge. So Elsevier, Taylor and Francis make money from us. So a colonial modernity, capitalist modernity, will become part of this. And universities then have to, managers, leaders, students asking about that kind of changing from an extroverted kind of knowledge without bodies to one that recognizes that there are bodies here. We don't just bring our minds into the class. And I think I want to stop right there.